I'm your host, Amanda Ulrich, and today we are joined by Bradley Hope, who is a journalist, a best-selling author, and also a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Bradley, thanks so much for joining the Sunday Long Read podcast.
My pleasure.
So you have a lot of things on your resume, a very long, impressive resume that we could mention, including being the co-founder of the production company Brazen. But I am curious, if you are meeting someone randomly for the first time, what do you tell them you do? Like, which of these hats do you mention first?
Yeah, I know that's actually an interesting question. To some extent, I might change it a little bit depending on the person, but I would say the most common thing I say is I'm a journalist. But I say I'm an independent journalist, that I also help run a production company, and I'm operating in a lot of different mediums, whether it's long form as books or magazine articles, but also as podcasts, documentaries, film and television. So it's one of those things where you can keep going if you aren't careful.
Right. I mean, because as I was putting together kind of a short description of your bio, there are lots of different pieces to it, not just journalist, but also having written best-selling books and working with Brazen. And there are lots of these different pieces. So that's interesting that you see yourself as kind of a journalist first and foremost.
Yeah, I spent most of my life as a journalist, so it's kind of easy reflex to just say, and it is true. I mean, to be honest, I even take a journalistic perspective to everything I do. So it's fine to say that, it makes sense.
So today we're talking about this recent story that you wrote for Wired, which was a big hit among Sunday Long Read subscribers, but also far beyond that. And I'm very glad that we're talking about it, because after I read it, I had a lot of questions. But very basically, it is a story that you are writing about a super yacht that sank kind of mysteriously off the coast of Italy last year, killing 7 people, including the super yacht's owner, Mike Lynch. And this spawned lots of conspiracy theories about the strange timing of all of this, and maybe, what other hands could be at play here. Can you kind of talk about, maybe for those who haven't read your story or haven't heard of this, just kind of basically what happened, and then how you first came to the story?
Yeah. Well, I think in a way, the story of Mike Lynch itself was kind of in the background. It wasn't a story that most people were super aware of. It was probably a little bit more well-known in the UK, but the reason that it's not that understood or well-known is because it's been going on for such a long time. This has been going on for like a decade. He was this big British businessman. They called him the Bill Gates of the UK. He sold his company to HP and became very wealthy. Then HP alleged he had defrauded them through misrepresenting things about the company that led to them overpaying. And then it became this long legal battle between him and HP, but then also with there was a civil case in the UK, but then there was a criminal case in the US. By the time he went on trial in the US, most people were not really, they couldn't remember what the story was all about, And so it was kind of flying below the radars. There was coverage, of course, but it was not, top of people's minds. Then he, so long and short of it, he won that case in the US out of nowhere, kind of unexpectedly. He went back to the UK and he was in this kind of celebratory mood. He had this yacht that he bought with the money from HP called Brazen, and he was taking out people on the yacht that he appreciated over the years. He wasn't able to do that for a while because when he was in the US, he had like an ankle bracelet. He was sort of on house arrest. So this was a big sort of exhalation, taking a breath and enjoying himself. And he invited like the lawyers that were involved in the case. And there was a previous trip than the one that we've written about, where other people joined him, even the security guard that was looking after him in the house in California ended up on the yacht at one point. It was a very broad group of people. And so this summer was all about celebration and getting back to life again. And there was still some legal battles to come, but nothing that serious for him. And so one of the trips they were out in the Mediterranean, and it was a perfect trip, nothing wrong, no bad weather. And then sort of on the final night, there was a forecast of some rain, and so they moved into a more protected spot. And then in at that night, there was just the craziest storm that struck. And it's so mysterious as well to really dig into it because the storm was so ferocious but so small. It was almost like a finger tracing through the ocean, and it sort of hit his boat. And it turned out also that this yacht had a serious flaw in it, which was it had this really tall mast, which gave it a weird center of gravity. And essentially, a tiny hurricane hit this yacht, and it sank. And many people died who were on the boat, and some of them survived. Anyway, so that's kind of the somewhat brief version of the story. Then the other thing that's even crazier is that while he was on the boat, the co-defendant in the case was struck by a car in the United Kingdom, and he also was fatally wounded, and he died about less than 24 hours after Mike Lynch died in a completely separate freak accident. And so for me, how I came across the story, I was familiar with the story. I kind of have a business journalism background. I used to work with the Wall Street Journal. I've never been overly businessy focused as a person, but I always considered it a very interesting stage for human drama. And so I was at the Wall Street Journal before, so I was familiar with the story, but not really the details of it. And when he was about to go on trial, I was introduced to his team. They were thinking that I might be interested in writing an article about him. And so they kind of came to me at that time. And I wasn't able to do it because he was unable to speak for the article. And so I thought, there's just no way I could write something about him, But it did kind of put it on my map more. And then when the accident happened, I was sort of mesmerized by it, just like everybody probably who was paying attention. And I didn't do very much on it. And then I just had this experience with the editor at Wired where we were talking about this story, and it just suddenly struck me as there was still an extraordinary journalistic opportunity with this story because, it was a classic story. It was caught up in the news cycle. There's lots of news coverage, and then there was a few enterprise kind of investigative stories, but none of them really tried to step back and figure out like what exactly is going on here. What's the story of this? How do we make sense of this? Like this two freak accidents happening within 24 hours. And of course, all of it aided by the Italian press, which is, making up a lot of details and, adding some lurid, reporting lines to the story. And as I started working on it, I was just suddenly struck by such a simple concept, which hadn't really been applied to the previous coverage of it. And that was how important the concept of probability was to his whole life. He came from a very humble background, and he managed to get this scholarship, which itself was sort of an improbable, thing for someone of his background. And it just, if you keep looking at what happened over and over again, these kind of crazy, improbable things happened. And even more important than that is the whole basis of his fortune was applying this sort of, at the time, somewhat esoteric, now very commonly discussed form of statistics called Bayesian reasoning. And it's not a crazy idea. It's not that complicated of an idea, but he saw a way to apply it to business, essentially, that would allow all of these benefits. It became a very powerful engine of everything he did. And so I was just, as I was reporting the story, I couldn't believe how much probability was at the center of his life, and how even during the trial, he kept asking his lawyer over and over again, what's the odds? What's the odds? Tell me the odds. And because he knew he had bad odds in this case, because if you go against the US government, it's often that you lose. And then for this to happen to him, and even just the kind of the wildness of that weather phenomenon, and so I found it to be just almost like writing a fairy tale. And I've never had that experience before, but it's just all of the stories, everything kind of lined up into this shape that I found very pleasing. And I really tried to, do my best of capturing that while obviously not trying to overly fit the story into that, into that kind of a framing.
What's interesting and sad about that is that you were hesitant to write a story when he was still alive because you wouldn't be able to speak with him. And then you did end up writing a story about him where you again couldn't speak with him. So there's something, I'm sure, sad and kind of jarring about that, how that turned out.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, there was just something about it that just doesn't make any sense. And I think that's something I found kind of almost as existential in this story is this happens a lot in our lives. Every person's life, they've kind of come across this phenomenon. It could be, we have all these words for it, fate, karma, and things like that. And those are words that are very rough approximations, just a word to make an excuse for something that happened in front of us. Some people think of it as divine or it comes from their religion. And I just, as I was working on this story, I just found myself very sort of smitten by that concept that we just have so little control. We have so little understanding. We're so bad at predicting. We could never predict anything that happens, really. We try our best. And even the kind of hubris of trying to predict things and why it's so impossible to predict things, the sheer complexity, all this stuff that maybe we learned in simple concepts like chaos theory, the butterfly effect, and so I mean, in a way, it's amazing. He would never have been on that yacht had it not been for these other improbable events, and everything sort of just conspired in a sense. And I think some people, it also explains the news coverage and why nobody could let it go. The Italians kept going on and on about how he had previously worked with MI5, and therefore on the boat in the safe were government secrets, and that was what this was all about, government secrets. There, and it's just like, of course, it just made me very reflective and philosophical in a way. Why do conspiracies exist, conspiracy theories? And it's because we can't bear to look at the absolute raw truth of the world, which is sometimes there is no conspiracy. It's just bad luck. And we don't even have words to really describe it.
How do you view your role as a journalist with this type of story when the conspiracy theory machine is working overtime in the beginning and there's tons of tabloid information that's not true, and all of this is happening for a year? The same length of time it takes for you to really be able to piece together what happened. How do you hope readers, what do you hope they take away from this? Do you hope that people's minds are changed? In the era of the internet and social media, can people wait a year to learn the complete truth about something? Or do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about what people take away from something like this?
Yeah. Well, I think in a way, I didn't really even get too caught up in the conspiracy theories of it. And I found in the reporting that it was very easy to very quickly establish that none of those things have any basis whatsoever. Like there's just not a single shred of any kind of evidence to suggest it was anything other than what it was, And I think it was really the result of more like lazy journalism that it even became a thing. And so, but I think, this is often the case, like even when a book comes out about a topic that you read about in the newspaper, your first thought is like, oh, I've already know this story. But inevitably, if you pick up the book and if it's well done, you're sort of blown away by how little you actually did know, and how little you made all the connections of it. And I had this experience with the 1MDB scandal. We covered it very forensically in the newspaper, and there was, of course, narrative and characters and drama, but in reality, the average reader would have been kind of, dizzy from all of the money flows and the allegations and the denying the allegations. When we were able to finally write a book, people would say to me, wow, oh, now I get it. This is a really crazy scandal. This is a big deal. But when we were reading the coverage, you didn't quite understand. And I think that's something similar happens at every kind of level. There's the news coverage, then there's the more intense magazine coverage, then there's a book coverage in some cases, or the documentary. Even now where people get really enraptured by documentaries about people that you thought you knew. Like right now, everyone's talking about the Charlie Sheen documentary, and everybody kind of read the stories, saw the movies, but they never saw it all in one place in this kind of different format. So I think my experience was I felt very grateful to work on the story, and I felt lucky because in a way, to borrow a maritime analogy, I really felt like I had wind in my sails as I was working on the story, that things were kind of coming together quite well. And there were some tricky aspects of the story, and there's still, more to be done on the story too for somebody else to work on. But I found that I could get to where I got relatively easily compared to other stories.
You say in this story that you pieced together reports, documents, of course, lots of interviews. But I think at one point you said you spoke with people who were familiar with the accounts of the survivors and crew. Does that mean that you didn't end up being able to speak with anyone who was on the boat at the time?
No, it's a phrase probably from newspaper journalism, which is just designed to protect the specificity of the person you spoke to. So it's probably not very commonly used in magazines, but sometimes there are situations like in this story, there's still ongoing investigations, legal things that it was important to, not necessarily reveal all of our sources, for the story. But we tried to keep in general, I always want to just have on the record sources if I can. I find it to be tiresome to have people who are not directly on the record, but you have to just sort of, that's just how it works, I guess.
Oh, some of the most powerful details of this story is, of course, when you're describing as soon as the boat starts capsizing, tips over, and people are rushing to try and get out of the water, get off of the boat. And some people don't, of course. As you're writing some of those scenes and you're thinking about narrative journalism and painting this really vivid picture, how did you kind of balance wanting people to really have this vivid idea of what this was like, and then also remembering this really happened to people? Did you kind of feel yourself getting lost in the narrative and then pulling yourself out and remembering this is a real thing, not just some crazy story?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, and in a way, you're reminded of that in your interaction with people, because when you're speaking to them and your journalistic side of your mind is excited to be hearing the story and getting the details and visualizing it, but then sometimes you forget your sort of humane side, which is you're dealing with people who have been traumatized or their friends have been traumatized. But I didn't find myself straying too far. I would say, though, that section of the story was the part that consumed more of my time than any other section, because it is such a complex, period of time, even though it's like under 15, 18 minutes, to try to understand how that worked forensically, moment to moment. And also, it's just also difficult to write because there's people in different places. So there's different things happening at the same time, and there's some things that are happening just subsequently or consecutively. And so I really struggle with that. And in order to write it, I created a separate document, which is like second by second, as much as I could, what happened, where this person was. And I spent so much time looking at this blueprint of the boat, and I think you're not supposed to call it a boat, yacht. And I looked at pictures of the yacht. I looked at every video that you could ever find of the Brazen yacht, the interiors, the exterior. And I actually really struggled to visualize what it looked like on its side, inside the yacht. And I just would try harder and harder and try to think about it and visualize it, and go back to people who knew about the details and say, okay, is this right? And then try it again. And so I think that was really hard to do. And one of my favorite discoveries was this video clip from the deckhand from the top of the yacht. And as soon as I found that, I felt like I knew my whole structure instantly, because it's such a foreboding video clip, which I shared on my social media. It wasn't shared in the actual article, but it's just such a foreboding storm on the horizon. And it's got this like purple black coloring, and it's not all clear. It kind of goes dark and then it kind of lights up. And I just found it to be so ominous that the deckhand captured that, went about his business, put it on Instagram, and then some short time later, that storm just hit that yacht with a huge force. And so I just knew right away that I wanted to kind of open with that image and then sort of go back in time and explain who the people are on this yacht and how they came to be there, and then get back to the, this is cinematic part.
Yeah, I mean, it really goes to show, didn't he also set the video to the song Thunderstruck too?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So
crazy.
you're right. So, I mean, clearly it's showing how in life or death moments like this, you don't necessarily realize it's a life or death moment until, you try and cope with it as best you can until you realize this isn't just another day, another storm.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, for sure. People who are on this yacht, it is the most shocking thing ever, right? Because they're on a yacht. They just have this assumption. They're very close to the shore. They're not even far from the shore at all. They just have this very simple, safe feeling, this assumption that this yacht is going to stay in this position. And it's just out of nowhere, really, this storm hit. And, nothing in the weather predicted it would happen like that or anything, and even people just didn't understand how vulnerable this yacht was to this particular storm, and even the speed of it, because maybe another few minutes could have happened, even seconds. The yacht could have been positioned differently in order to prevent it from capsizing. And so, it's one of those kind of existence shattering things that happen to somebody. You never quite feel the same again.
So in the end, do you think the main takeaway here is that the mast, which was unusually tall and one of the most striking, unique things about this boat, that in the end, that was likely the main reason why the boat sank? After
I do. I think so. I think so. I think that is the number one factor for it tipping over at the moment that it did. Had it been a different shape, a different size mast, I think there's a chance they could have positioned it in a way that the wind was sort of pushing it along as if it was going forward rather than hitting it broadly against the side of the yacht. And because, if you could have just positioned it faster, they were about to reposition it. Everybody was jumped to the attention, was ready to go. The engines were on, everything was ready, but they weren't fast enough. And because of the mast, they just didn't have any time to really, counteract. And I think had it been a smaller yacht, a different size mast, I think they could have gotten into that position and they would have been less likely to tip over. Simple as that. And everything else is probably a factor. Like, you could argue that everything's a factor. Maybe somebody tripped and fell and lost 2 seconds, and that was a small contribution to what happened. But the biggest contribution, I think, from my opinion, is the mast.
Hey everyone, Amanda here with a quick intermission. If you're liking this episode and want more behind-the-scenes stories like this one, make sure to follow the Sunday Long Read podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also check out our website at sundaylongread.com. There you'll find original stories, our true crime newsletter, and of course, our weekly newsletter. You can become a Sunday Long Read member for only $5 a month and get early and exclusive editions of the newsletter. And now, back to the episode. So, I mean, this story, you have a complex main character, this very big, bold story. These are also the types of stories that it seems like you focus on with Brazen. Why are these types of stories, why are they important to you to tell? And why do you, I can imagine that clearly audiences resonate with them, but why are these the things that you gravitate towards?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, maybe to my own fault, I never really worry too much about what the audience will resonate with, because I've struggled to guess. But I think about people that I'm interested in or stories I'm interested in. And I've always been interested in characters that are kind of on the edge somehow. They could be rogues, they could be criminals, they could be, and even in my reporting life, I spend so much time with people that I just think are great teachers for how the world actually works. It's so different than this idealized form that we think how things work. And so that's taken me on a lot of different paths, and I've never been even particularly thematic. I spent several years at the Wall Street Journal covering the quants, which are sort of the math-oriented investors who explain some of my interest in Mike Lynch because they use computers to try to predict the future. And I was truly mesmerized by talking to these people, and even the technical things they had to say, I was still interested just because I just was so fascinated by the idea of probability and trying to predict the future. And then I've done work on, a big financial criminal, Joe Low, and the 1MDB scandal, and I co-wrote the profile of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And for me, it's just, these are all just amazing worlds that are around us. And I'm just looking for a way in, a window into those worlds. And in this story, I think Mike Lynch did capture me as a character. He was so polarizing in some ways. And also, it sounds like the kind of person that if you get along with him, it's one of the best relationships of your life. And if you don't get along with him, it's one of the worst. And so there's something just fascinating about that. And even what he did in business wasn't particularly awe-inspiring in a way because it was so almost like bureaucratic. It was like sorting emails in a company using a software system. But everything else about him was pretty fascinating. And there's so much I wasn't able to include. And one of them that I really enjoyed was he was just a perpetual tinkerer. He's always tinkering with things, trying to build things. And during COVID, he and his team invented a new kind of a software that would help communicate to another phone that they had just come in proximity of someone with COVID. And there was an existing government version that was like totally broken, didn't work. And he had this idea that I remember something from a textbook about how Russian submarines use this to detect other submarines. And he just like zoomed into that concept. He did some deep research, read these old books and got his team to build it. And nothing ever came of it, but I just love that he couldn't help but keep inventing things all the time. He was really a serial inventor.
Definitely. Some of the, I feel like, conventional wisdom in journalism is to kind of have this very well-defined beat that you are the expert in. But I also find this with myself is my subject area that I write about is a little bit more ambiguous. It's not so specific, which it sounds like maybe a little bit similar to the types of stories that you choose. How do you find that that's been difficult to describe these are the types of stories that I do, or you've gotten to the point in your career where people trust you to tell this story? And so when you have a story, you don't necessarily need to explain, this is my beat, this is my subject area. You just kind of have that weight behind you that you can work on the stories you want to write.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do believe in beats. I mean, I've had many beats over my career. I started off as a police reporter and I did crime and went through many phases, and I really, embraced those beats and just lived and breathed them. And I think that is really important to being able to find good stories, because if you're just sitting around and you're looking for a good story, you won't really know where to look. You have to have something guiding you, some sort of a path or some sort of a compass. But I think by this point for me, I've also just I keep writing different random things. So if I say to people that I just look for stories that I really like about people, and if I think in general at this point, no one's pushing back on me when I try to do that. But it is a little confusing even for myself sometimes about what I should be doing with my time, because I do find myself chasing many different trails all the time, and there's nothing I love to do more than report, and I could just report all day, but at some point you have to kind of buckle down and get the job done.
Yeah. Do you think you get some of that flexibility more with your production company, Brazen? Do you think that, what were your goals in and your hopes for things that legacy media can't necessarily do? What were kind of your goals with Brazen in let's think about this new type of media experience, media company.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, I had a great job at the Wall Street Journal. I was kind of a roving enterprise reporter, and I could write about a variety of, I could kind of go into different topics or different beats. But I did feel sort of stultified by the format that I could write for. So at the time, it's changed over time, it's improving and diversifying. But there was something called a leader, which is the front page enterprise story. It's about 2,000 words. And that was kind of the space that you could fill for your enterprise project. And I just found that to be like, if I was looking forward in my life, am I just going to write a series of those over time? And I just found it to be not what I wanted to do. So I wanted to have the freedom also to make decisions or go places that I would have to go through a bureaucratic process to do, try different mediums. Like I was interested in audio at that time and still am. And so in general, Tom and I both, we just wanted freedom to pursue things the way we wanted to pursue them. And the real epiphany for us was having worked together on a book. We realized that when you write a book, you're not really edited by an editor in the traditional sense, like, the way you are in a newspaper. And so we wrote the whole book by ourselves. Essentially, we had a great book editor who gave us feedback, but it really felt like something that we truly owned because we had done everything. There was nobody else really involved. And so we just kind of, I think once you get that taste, it's hard to let go of it. And it's hard to just write a book over and over again. So we wanted to try other kind of intensive long form mediums. And we've always got like crazy ideas about things that we want to do. And so it's also a very experimental place to sit because we're so independent, there's kind of lower stakes for our experiments than if you were a newspaper or something like that.
For sure. I think what makes sense too is that you're marrying different parts of this process that, in the past have been separate. So you're having the long form storytelling, but then you're also in the same place thinking, what's the production of this? Could this become a TV series or a feature film, or, what's podcasting look like? It makes sense that you would in the same place combine all of these things. Whereas a traditional news outlet is only thinking about the first piece.
Yeah, and also the other thing I would add to that is that if you're in a newspaper or if you're in a magazine, you're just not in the room for any other discussions. Like you are just the person who does the article. But in this position I'm in, I'm talking to all these other people and I'm understanding about all these things that are lost in translation usually between the different people that it gets to, And so I found it to be very rewarding too. We're working a lot in documentaries in a variety of ways, and I find they're all shocked to talk to somebody who has a journalism background. Documentary people, on average, don't come from a journalism background, and the people who commission them don't really come from a journalism background, and they're just sort of mesmerized by, oh wow, you can just call that person, and this is what happens next, and it's kind of how it should be. And maybe I'm a little overly optimistic that journalists can do way more than just what is conventionally thought of as journalism.
Right. I mean, that does make sense. As soon as you realize just for a story that you can call, even if you're just starting out, call some huge person and they will probably answer and do an interview with you. After that, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't be able to call anyone, for anything.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. Most people are shocked by that concept. They think you have to go through like a permissioned process and that's the good thing about journalists is they just don't seem to be afraid to pick up the phone and call the top person. I've always liked that aspect of it.
Definitely. In thinking about narrative writing, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic with the elephant in the room with AI? I know in the past you've said, currently it's interesting how AI can supplement the production elements, research elements. But how do you feel about, in the near or distant future, the fact that AI could replace really quality narrative journalism?
Well, I suppose I do think it's technically possible that it could do that. It doesn't feel, I wrote like an essay about this on LinkedIn, which is one of the problems with narrative journalism isn't lining up the facts and the right order or anything like that. There's something about narrative journalism that is very biased, ironically. And AI is really bad at being biased because it's by nature, by its engineering, is very universal. And so if you try to write every story in a universal way, it always kind of falls flat. Something about it feels like something's missing from it. And so, we're talking about things we're interested in, types of stories we're interested in. AI doesn't have interests. Somebody has to tell it to be interested in something. And this concept of what you're interested in is so nuanced and so specific and so has a spectrum to it and a tinge to it that it's really hard to figure out how you could bestow that upon an alien intelligence. So there's this feeling that I have that things that are authored are always going to be still in demand, because ultimately we're writing for other people. And if you try to get AI is great at summarizing information and doing many amazing things, no doubt about it. But I don't think it's very good at this. And if you used AI to work on this, it would be just as time consuming as not using AI to work on this, and there might be aspects of the process of narrative journalism that are, improved. But I think in general, it will still come down to this, that's the other thing. AI is very bad at being original. Every story needs to fit the shape of the narrative and the person's experience and everything they've ever read, and everything they haven't read is also important. Like, you've only read certain things, and that also affects your unique DNA as a writer, So I think it will be very hard for AI to supplant long form narrative journalism in the near future. But of course, it's good at a lot of other things, and even things that traditionally journalists did when they first started out is, like when I first started out, I remember I got paid to write briefs, but there's no way that someone's going to be writing briefs in the future. Like briefs are just going to get written and maybe edited by a human. But so there is some element of the apprenticeship process that's missing from this.
Right. Because to get to the point where you're writing long form narrative journalism, you have to be writing those smaller stories on the court beat, the crime beat. Do you think that it's going to become more challenging to be able to flex that creativity in a longer way? It seems that you are not, based on what I've seen you say in the past, not as pessimistic about some of these things, which I think is a good thing.
No, I'm not pessimistic about it at all. I think people just have to, no one wants to adapt because everything's changing around them. So they'd rather do it the way they did before. And there's always going to be something that's lost generation by generation, And I'm sure there's so many things about, like, it used to be a good job to be in journalism and you could get paid well and things like that. And that's not quite the case anymore. But so yeah, I'm optimistic. And I also think for things like investigative journalism, for basically giving yourself more time to do high quality work, if you can master AI to do things that you don't want to do or that you don't want to spend all your brain power on, then you should be able to use it for other things. And I think the key thing is that people avoid this thing people have talked about, which is like ChatGPT brain, where if you get so used to using it all the time that you almost like lose that feel for typing out a story and crafting something. And that is little bit dangerous, I think. But I think in general, I'm on the whole optimistic. I just think that people have to be commanding AI and rather than AI commanding them. And so in the media environment, there's some tension around this too, which is institutions are saying, use AI. We think it's going to help us. But there's not a lot of training going on or even really discussion of what that means exactly. What exactly does that mean? And sometimes I give a talk at companies who are trying to understand AI, and I call it the humanities guide to AI, where I say, listen, the trick about AI is to not think of it as a technology. Think of it as an alien force, intelligence, but it's very erudite, and you can speak to it, and it only understands you if you're very precise in what you're saying. And I think in a way that puts journalists in a very good journalists, writers, and people who work in knowledge in a very good position in this new economic time. But there's a lot that you have to do to be, positioning yourself well.
Definitely. Yeah. The thing I've been thinking a lot recently is, legacy media, traditional news outlets, when the internet came around, kind of didn't want to accept that was happening, which made things confusing with, for after that, reading a story online was free. People got used to the fact that that was free. And then after that, didn't want, if there was a paywall, didn't want to pay for journalism when in the past, of course, you'd buy a newspaper. There was no getting it for free. I wonder if you think that news outlets, legacy media is handling AI in a similar way as the internet, just hoping that it will go away, and kind of what your guidance there would be.
Yeah. Well, I've seen, I think a lot of the big institutions are very seriously working with it. Like the New York Times has a very impressive team. The Wall Street Journal, where I used to work, is really thinking hard about it. I think probably the most abuses are going to happen at the middle level, where people are like, oh, wait, we can make a lot more money by using AI to kind of put out a lot of content. And that's the part that's like not very nice. I think that's not a good trend. I think the most important thing is just creating a sandbox experience for people to be using it for problems they actually have. That's where you actually really get to understand the capabilities of AI, is where you're under pressure. You need to do something. You have limited time. How can I use this to solve a problem for me? And that's where you really get to understand where it's reliable and where it's unreliable. And I think that's really important. I think also newspapers have to work on how to, best practices for how to use it and where to use it and where not to use it and all that kind of thing too. But in general, I think, anyways, I'm not too worried about it. I think it's also kind of democratizing too. Like AI does a lot of open source research that humans used to do by like Google searching, and now I can't even think of using Google. It's like a hard concept in my mind now. It sounds so quaint and so historical, like an ancient technology. And now I think in general, there's a lot of knowledge discovery that can happen a lot better. Like if you're a beat reporter in 2025, if you're like an AI enhanced beat reporter, you should just be knowing everything that's going on in that beat in a way that no beat reporter ever knew before. And because you have all that coming into you, you can spend all your time having lunch, having breakfast, having meetings, calling people, and then marrying those two things together, you're going to have much better coverage, on the pure news side. So yeah, anyways, I think about this a lot, and I write about it on LinkedIn a lot too.
Aside from AI, what do you hope is kind of the future? And this is a very open-ended question, but the future of narrative long-form journalism. Do you think there will always be this appetite for it? And what do you hope happens in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I think ironically, there was this time where everyone got really excited about all these other mediums, documentaries, audio. And in my experience these last few years at Brazen, I've really come to the conclusion that you don't need to do all these versions of the same story. Like there's some stories that just work so well as a magazine story, and some that work so well as a podcast, but they wouldn't be a great magazine story. So I become almost like sort of conservative about how to spend your time, and you should really let the story dictate the medium. And I think I'm hopeful that more people can experiment across mediums, because there are some stories that just do so well in audio that would never have done anything in any other format. And in general, I think though, having experienced these other mediums, I just became even more appreciative of pure print writing journalism, because there's just something about it. There's so much freedom and there's so much less friction. Just the act of editing something in audio or video is so complex and so time-consuming and so expensive as well. So I think I've really just rediscovered print recently, and I'm just all about it. And I think that will always continue. One of the things I think of in the future though is that narrative will always be a premium thing. It will always be so important. It's kind of one of the most human technologies, and that's how our brains work. And I think there's a future where that will still be, the focus of a lot of people, but there will be a way for other people to interact with the underlying information of a story, to be able to ask questions and get very precise answers. I think would be a really amazing outcome from the AI generation, is that if I have a specific question and I want to ask it and I can get that answer, it's just such a powerful accelerator for everything, for if you're a journalist or if you're a scientist or whatever it might be. And so I think part of media is going to be figuring out how to enrich that ecosystem, because one of the challenges of AI is everything that it's trained on or everything it's pulling from is what already exists in some format. But the magic of journalism is that we're finding things that are not yet on the internet, that are not yet in print. And so I think this concept of enriching a knowledge universe is part of the media experience. And so there's different ways to feed into that. It's not just narrative. Narrative is how humans interact, but I think media in general could do a better job of adding to that without just printing articles one after another, you know? Like, for example, let's take this story. So the narrative is very clear, like this is the best way to consume it as a person. But there might be some people that are interested in other aspects of it, like the weather that happened on that time. Or maybe somebody is just, would like to know about yacht design or whatever. And there would be a way that there could be underneath the surface of that narrative a lot more information to interact with. Think about all of the stuff that you gather for a story that you write. And then you kind of, it's like, if you print it out as a huge folder and it just like goes on a shelf somewhere. But what if like some of that, at least some of it, was somehow added to the mixture and was, you were adding more to the knowledge world than just a single narrative, So that's one thing I've been thinking about a lot. But I really, at the end of the day, I'm very bullish on just the long lasting power and value of just narrative journalism in general.
Definitely. Yeah, I like the kind of idea of being medium agnostic in a way. There's no reason if you are traditionally a print journalist to be scared of, podcasting or a series or a feature film. So yeah, that's interesting. And of course, I think that younger journalists already get that. The idea that you kind of have to wear many hats and be versatile in those different ways. But I like that concept where a narrative is a narrative across different mediums.
Yeah. And also you find though, if you come from print and you work in audio, the audio people are a bit suspicious of you, but it tends to be that if you work together, there's something even better happens, because people who are very writerly or very narrative focused, they don't get as caught up in things like the atmospheric sounds and stuff. They're thinking about the pure storytelling. So there's a lot of good things that happen when somebody who thinks they have a specialty in one space works in another space too.
Definitely. Well, Bradley, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have to keep an eye out for your next stories.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
This episode of the Sunday Long Read podcast was produced by Matthew Whitehurst and me, Amanda Ulrich. The co-founders of the Sunday Long Read newsletter are Jacob Feldman and Don Van Natta Jr. Until next time, thanks for listening.